Everyone, how you doing? Welcome to the Global DeFi Summit. Welcome, James and Long. Nice to meet you guys.
Hey, great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So I believe Edan's not going to make it this evening, so let's just kick right into it. I wanted to start off just by, obviously the focus today is to really dig into interoperability and DeFi in how it's evolving. It's obviously evolving at a really torrid pace right now. And both of you, I think, are really adept and are going to be helpful in helping us kind of unpack all of this. So just to start out, if James, maybe you could start first, and then Long. I'd love to hear a little bit about each of your backgrounds and the Ren project and Celo, and we can get into what they are, what problems they're trying to solve, and how they interact with interoperability in DeFi.
Sure. My name is James Prestwich. I've been working full-time in the crypto space for about 7-8 years now, and full-time on interoperability for the last 4 years, since late 2017, basically. I co-founded Storage and Suma. In 2020, Sumo was acquired by C Labs, and now I work full-time on Celo. Celo is a proof-of-stake blockchain running an EVM, so you can deploy all your Solidity contracts on Celo as well as on Ethereum and other places. Inside C Labs, I lead the interoperability team. We're currently working on Optics, which is a gas-efficient standard for cross-chain communication and bridging tokens.
Great.
Hey everyone, my name's Loong. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the Ren Protocol. My background came from sort of, I guess, an academic background, studying distributed systems, and got into the blockchain space, 2017, maybe mid-2017. And co-founded Ren with my co-founder Ty. And since then we've been working on, well, originally we were actually working on something a little bit different, but we pivoted pretty quickly into the interoperability space. And then since then we've been working on that. And our goal really is to try and connect as many different chains to each other as possible, get as many different assets on as many different chains as possible, while still enabling some smart contracts to be called at the same time instead of just moving assets. And really what we want to achieve is the ability to support any type of token on any type of chain, and for general purpose applications as well, not just any one specific application.
Got it. And this is also a question for both of you, and we can go in the same order. And by way of my background, just so you know, I consult with Bitcoin Magazine. I would consider myself a Bitcoin maximalist, but not a toxic one. I work in the hedge fund industry, so I've been involved in finance around 17 years, and I've been involved in crypto for the last 3 or 4. My expertise in your field is limited, so I think that gives us a good way to kind of delve into this from a beginner's mind a little bit, for those out there, and then we can of course get deeper and deeper if we get a little more in the weeds. But just taking a giant step back, when both of you think about interoperability and the problems they're trying to solve, what do you think the end game is? Obviously, fungibility across chains, across assets, is kind of the paramount goal at the beginning. But kind of where do you see all this evolving? Maybe in the next 12 to 24 months, as we know that's a lifetime in crypto. Maybe James, you can start.
Yeah, I think it's a little funny that you call yourself a Bitcoin maximalist. I would definitely consider Loong and myself to be a little Bitcoin forward. The main interoperability projects that each of us have shipped focus on Bitcoin. So obviously Ren BTC, and I contributed a good chunk of the core TBTC code base. The long-term goal here is really to kind of break down a lot of those barriers between chains that keep Bitcoin out of DeFi or keep Ethereum confined to a single chain right now. In the next 12 to 24 months, I think we're going to see a lot of the a lot of standardization and consolidation around bridges. Right now, basically everyone runs their own bespoke bridge from point to point, and I think we're going to see a lot more. We're going to see these bridges kind of aggregate into a few bridges that are going a lot of different places.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason, why, you might want to achieve interoperability. I mean, with something like Bitcoin, it's a bit obvious because it doesn't have this kind of smart contract capabilities that Ethereum has. So if you want that, you have to have interoperability. But all the different L1s and even, the different L2s that are coming out, they all make different trade-offs, on various different metrics that different developers care differently about. So you might be willing to trade off super high speed and super low transaction fees for a little bit of decentralization if you're working with an application that really needs that in order to function correctly, and you don't want to be locked out of the other people that need different trade-offs. So you kind of want to be able to go to the chain that you need for the things that you need, and I think being able to create applications that as one application actually span multiple chains and for the different parts of it are able to leverage the different advantages that are needed. I think that's going to be something that becomes a little bit more popular over the next 1 to 2 years. I also hope we start to see, in line with standardization, a little bit more in the way of multi-chain wallets, where you can have like MetaMask that actually also lets you hold, interact with multiple chains simultaneously. You don't have to swap between different chains on the go, and you sort of beginning to work on that user experience layer much more.
Got it. So let's dig into each of your projects a little bit and try to understand them better. So when actually, Long, I'll start with you and Ren. When I started doing a little research on Ren, again, from a beginner's mindset, from a novice standpoint, when I think of Ren, I was thinking that it was almost like a middleware type of product. So yes, it's a blockchain, of course, and yes, it works towards interoperability, and there's a wallet system, and it's able to wrap assets. But when you think of your place in the entirety of the ecosystem, do you think of yourself more as a middleware product, or do you think of yourself more as a unique blockchain?
I think at the moment, I definitely think of us as middleware. That's a pretty good way to think about it. We're kind of like an L2 for interoperability. So you kind of plug yourself into various chains and enable new assets there. And there are other ways to do that. In fact, we've got James here who pioneered those other ways to do that, where you can't do interoperability directly in the chain. But sometimes, for example, in the case of Bitcoin, that's just not an option. You need that sort of like secondary layer, and so we bring that. I think the long-term goal, we are a blockchain, but we're kind of only a blockchain out of necessity, in the sense that if you want to coordinate large distributed decentralized network, that's the kind of infrastructure that you use. And so that's the reason we have one. I think we do anticipate to eventually allow a level of smart contract programming directly on our chain, so that you can build applications a little bit more efficiently, depending on what your goals are. But I think that's still a little ways away for our project. And so thinking of us as middleware is a reasonable mental model.
And you just had a great point, by the way, which is, you said you're a blockchain out of necessity. Is there a way in which you could see this ecosystem evolving so that you didn't need to be a blockchain, so that there could be applications that connect chains that don't require their own blockchain, their own node system, their own level of decentralization, where basically you can piggyback on top of existing, almost like the parachain concept, attaching yourself within the chain. Is that economical to be a blockchain, or is that just kind of part of the bootstrapping process, and that eventually this could look different?
Yeah. From that? I think certainly when we started, there was no way that was possible. You can do it without a blockchain. but you change the design space that you're kind of working in, and you kind of constrain yourself in different ways. The biggest constraint, and the primary reason we can sort of try to piggyback off an existing chain was tokens, and specifically gas tokens. So if you want to have a transaction that bounces across multiple chains, and you're trying to leverage their consensus layers, that means you're going to have to pay gas to them. And that kind of interrupts this user experience in a kind of awkward way, where you want to come to DeFi and you've got your Bitcoin, and that's, you want to enter this new space for the first time, but to do so, you need ETH. So now you got to go figure out where you get your ETH, but maybe that's actually what you wanted to do with your Bitcoin in the first place, was to enter the ETH ecosystem and, help flip it, or whatever it is that your goals might be. But I think today we're getting closer to a point where you can think about leveraging, at the very least, you can leverage other technology, right? So, I mean, we didn't have to invent our own consensus protocol. I mean, it sounds obvious, but back when we started, that wasn't so obvious. I think, today you're getting closer to a stage where you wouldn't even have to implement your own consensus protocol. You can just, pick something off the shelf and sort of modify it a little bit, and that comes with all sorts of, nice security guarantees, and certainly makes things easier.
Got it. And James, I'd like to shift over to you and kind of ask you the same basic question, which is, what is Celo? What does it solve? Sorry, I said Celo earlier. I mispronounced it. Tell me a little bit about, if you were talking to a noob such as myself, when I first came across it, I thought you had an interesting approach. Obviously, through your kind of public address, bootstrapping it through kind of the mobile system and the existing kind of mobile infrastructure, and you guys took a very different approach. So I'd love to kind of hear your thought process and how you guys see your project and how you see it evolving.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said earlier, Celo is itself a EVM plus proof of stake. So we're running proof of stake in the wild, and we're working with Ethereum style smart contracts. The focus of Celo is on kind of bringing the benefits of decentralization to parts of the world that are underserved by the traditional financial system. So a lot of the work that we've done has been outside of the US and Europe, with people on the ground in Africa and South America and the Philippines and around the world. I don't actually get out and travel as much as the rest of the team does, especially lately. But the reason that we agreed to join Celo is because we admired how mission-driven and how much attention they pay to trying to do good and to help people. My team at Celo specifically works on interoperability projects. So what we're working on right now is an interoperability standard that can be deployed on a bunch of different chains. The idea being that the ideal way to do interoperability is something like IBC or XCMP, where you have each chain running the consensus protocol of the other chain. In Ethereum, we run a Bitcoin relay that actually tracks the proof of work and replicates the entire Bitcoin header chain on Ethereum. We would love to be able to do that for every chain everywhere. But as Loong said, it's not really practical. You just can't do it. It's too expensive. It's too time consuming to implement. So what I work on right now is optics, which is saying basically, what's the minimal interoperability that we can build and we can deploy in a matter of months, rather than spending 2 to 3 years implementing the ideal version. Optics is in essentially alpha on testnets right now. So we're linking a Celo testnet to an Ethereum testnet, and we're going to expand outward from there.
Got it. And you mentioned being active. The project is being active in a lot of kind of developing economies, and obviously everything that's going on with strike in El Salvador and Latin America, it's a kind of a timely correlation. I'm curious your thoughts on what role you can play in this kind of seeming revolution. When I was first reading about Celo, it did actually, I did see some interlinkages between some of the things that are being done with, a platform like Strike, and being so UX focused. It seems to be a huge part of what you do, and that's a really a breath of fresh air in a world where that's not really a major focus. And obviously, if I think regardless of your view about the crypto universe, I think we all want to see greater adoption, and that's a huge part of it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of these developments that are very recent, how you see Celo fitting into that, and how you see some of these payments and remittance solutions potentially evolving into a DeFi solution for the unbanked.
Yeah, it's a really interesting problem because as an engineer living in the US, my day-to-day life is significantly different from someone living in the Philippines. Celo has paid a lot of attention to what is the actual, user experience of people in other countries. How do they interact with the internet in general and financial services in particular? A lot of this means heavy focus on mobile user experience, particularly on older phones. We can't rely on everybody to have the latest iPhone. We like to think about the mobile phone number as an identifier that's persistent for a human being. And so we have some great open standards for how you can have a persistent identity that's based on the mobile number, and you can custody funds and access financial services using your mobile number. Really, I think that a lot of the journey for things like Celo and for Strike is learning how to go where people are and build services that are useful to people with a very different life experience than us.
Yeah. We've all seen ever since last summer how DeFi has exploded, and much of the use case so far, especially from a vantage point for someone like myself who comes from finance, is seeing kind of the financialization of a lot of crypto use cases, which we can sit here and probably have an entire conversation about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think we can all agree that regardless of your ethical viewpoint about that, that it has served a great proving ground and a great experimental landscape for a lot of these different solutions to test themselves and to kind of stress test. But I think you just made a great point, which is to really move to, that those are very narrow use cases that are being applied right now. And what you're referring to, and I think what both of you guys seem to be trying to solve, is really reaching a wider audience. I'm curious, by the way, again, excuse my ignorance, but in using a kind of the mobile number as your public key or your public address in some way, rather than a QR code, was the reason for that because it's simpler, it's more economical, or like you said, it's because some of the people that you're trying to serve have very, very basic access to technology, and a phone number is really ubiquitous. It's something that everybody has. And is that really kind of the broadest way to reach them?
Yeah, I think that what you want to do is you want to try to find the identifier that everybody already has and understands, and then figure out how you can safely and securely connect that to crypto. A lot of the interoperability projects that we work on, going from chain to chain, and I'm sure Ran has experienced this as well, is trying to find the software and the tools that people are already familiar with, and trying not to kind of shake up the user experience too much.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, right?
Yeah.
So getting back to Ren, and I kind of wanted to dig in a little bit into the centralization aspect, and we talked about bootstrapping, and we talked about the end game being a decentralized or a distributed system at least, and that obviously takes time. You can't start that way with most of these projects. Long, I'd love to hear kind of your view as to how Ren plans on getting there. I believe you need to be a node on the Ren protocol. You need 100,000 Ren tokens, which is around $35,000 at the moment. I mean, how do you try to expand the security reach in the breadth of security to improve decentralization? I'd really love to dig into this because it's coming from my background. That's always the sticking point that I think a lot of Bitcoiners really get nervous about with some of these trade-offs, right?
Yeah. I think so. It's actually a really difficult problem. So something that's kind of unique about a network that uses the kind of technology that we use is that you can't have a traditional proof of stake idea where your sort of portion of the network is equal to your portion of the stake. You have to discretize it because a fundamental part of the underlying sort of mathematics is this idea of a distinct identity. And that is what your share of the network is represented by, which is why you can't bond an arbitrary amount of Ren and then have your stake kind of be proportional. It has to come in lots of 100,000, and every single lot has to have a unique identity associated with it. And then they get treated as they're completely differently. So when you kind of shuffle the network around, you really kind of want to avoid having too many of the same identities owned by different identities owned by the same people end up in the same sort of place. So that's why it comes in lots of 100,000. I mean, this was a number that we set to kind of get to a 10,000 max node size, which we felt was reasonable. And at the time, Ren was 5 cents, and so $5,000 for a node seemed kind of reasonable. We want to be able to move all of these parameters of the system off to governance in the future. We've already started sort of experimenting with different governance mechanisms. They're still, I guess, in that experimental phase where you can play around with the voting system, but then if some crazy vote gets through, we still have the authority to say, no, we're not doing that. That's insane. And that gives us the flexibility to kind of test what's actually going to work, and then get a bit of confidence that this is not allowing people to do silly things, and then let go of the reins. There is this trade-off because people are looking at setting up pooling sources, which is a classic for people who don't have 100,000 Ren and they want to get together with their buddy, and maybe you have 50,000 and I have 50,000, so we get together and we can run a node together. It's a win and a loss in some ways, pooling services. It's obviously a win because you get more people into your ecosystem, you get more people interested in the project, they can start contributing, they can start thinking about governance, they can start earning fees, and then eventually work their way up to 100,000 Ren. But it's obviously a disadvantage in the sense that it can go too far that way, and you can have pooling services that make up the vast majority of your network, and then in practice your whole network actually only ends up being run by one organization because everyone's just delegating their assets there. So to kind of counteract that, we have tried to make the setup process for someone who does have the ability to run a single node as simple as possible. And since if you can cut out the pooling service, you obviously get to cut out the fees that they're going to take from you. And so if the user experience of setting up a node is truly simple and easy and accessible, then we hope that people will favor that when they can.
Got it. And James, what are your thoughts about how to solve this issue, and how are you guys thinking about it in Celo?
I'm not extremely concerned about it. Celo uses pools for voting for the proof of stake system. My general take here is that, as a Bitcoiner, if you're comfortable using Liquid, you should probably be comfortable using Ren or TBTC. This is, we're doing significantly better than Blockstream is here. Yeah. I don't think of this as a problem. I think of it as something to inform users about so that they can make good decisions on their own.
That's a fair point. And also, James, a follow-up question for you, kind of switching gears a little bit here. Again, for someone such as myself who's not as technically oriented as maybe some of the people listening in right now, but I think there's a wide variety of listeners. So I'd love to ask the question. You guys chose to use like the practical, a PBFT, I believe, solution, and it sounds similar to like a Ripple or Stellar. In what way does such a protocol help improve finality and help improve throughput, which are obviously kind of two main issues for any interoperability focused system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so specifically, Celo uses IBFT, Istanbul Byzantine Fault Tolerance. We use a slight variation on the well-known paper there. It's closer to like the Tendermint than it is to the Ripple or Stellar kind of thing.
Okay.
The main benefit of using proof of stake over proof of work is that you can cut down the block times. I don't really want to get into the technical reasons why, because we'll end up being here for 2 hours. But it's reasonable to take the block times down like 50% or more. The downside is that you lose the objectivity of proof of work and some other really nice properties. I work on both proof of work and proof of stake chains all the time. I'm not a hard partisan either way. I think that they're both useful and have their place.
Got it. Okay, so before we kind of start to wind down, I'd love to take a giant step back here. One issue is, it seems like, continues to evolve is that the more blockchains that proliferate, the more interoperability is needed. At what point does this reach a saturation point? We've all kind of accepted that there's kind of a multiverse world that we've evolved into and will stabilize at some level. But it does feel a little bit like whack-a-mole in the sense that you can't continue to kind of try to scale if you're constantly trying to kind of horizontally bridge. So, if you're trying to kind of think about the eventuality here, I'd love to hear both of your thoughts as to how many chains you think are needed, and where does interoperability end, and where can it kind of start to scale vertically and develop kind of vertical solutions on top of the existing ecosystem before it kind of hits a point beyond what's necessary. Long, maybe we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, that's so I think to some extent this comes back to something that James said at the very beginning, which is that this sort of like point to point becomes completely unviable, because if you imagine you have 10 chains, point to point means you need 100 bridges. But if you have 100 chains, point to point means you need 10,000 bridges, and each of these needs to be independently maintained. It has its own costs associated with it. It needs its own economics. It's just not viable. So the best you can do is sort of a hub and spoke style model where you have some standard or some system at the center that everyone interops with that. That's certainly made easier by, Ren just went through this thing called blockchain blitz. We added like 1 chain a week to our protocol, and it was insanely hard. Even considering standardized instruction sets. So, when we were looking at doing this, we said, okay, well, we're going to restrict ourselves to just EVM and Web3 compatible chains, because otherwise there's just no chance. And even then, it was really difficult. We spent a month working on it, and then, we're able to sort of smash out a couple in quick succession. And we were hoping that, we were like, cool, that's all the major chains that are kind of showing a little bit of traction at the moment. And by the time we were done, there were a whole bunch of new chains that were showing traction at the moment. And I think there's going to be, I don't know where that limit is. It's not a technical limit. I think it's not going to be the kind of thing where we hit all the different technical nuances and trade-offs and then we stop getting any more chains, because that's just not how it works. But we will see this natural limit where interoperability standards just can't keep up. And the benefit of being hooked into the ecosystem versus the benefit of being able to go off on your own and be your own chain stops, like it sort of starts going the other way, and people stop trying to produce their own L1s. I think we're not getting there yet, though. I think we're still a little while away from that. You know, I would like to be there, but yeah. And I think this is where standards like what James was talking about are really important. You know, something he said at the beginning was, you know, he wasn't exaggerating. We spent, I mean, you know, TBTC spent ages on this, and Ren, we spent 4 years on this. And I'm not going to say it's the ideal solution, right? There's tons of ways we can improve it. So yeah, the standards are going to be crucial for this.
Great. James, anything to add to that?
Yeah. So, you know, you said most of it. I don't think you can ever say that there are enough blockchains. Someone is always going to want to try and build another one. You know, we spent a lot of time building out the ideal way to do this, and Cosmos is doing that very well with IBC. The problem is that for any new chain, building out an IBC connection or building out a light client or relay takes 2 to 3 years minimum, getting it really good and stable and ready for deployment. So I think that the approach that, you know, I've taken and Ren has taken is that we want to try to minimize the overhead for adding new chains, so that we can pick and choose which places are worth connecting to the broader ecosystem, given that, you know, I have limited hours in my day to work on this.
Fair enough. Well, gentlemen, I think that's a good place to stop. I have a million more questions that I'd love to pick each of your brains on, but we'll have to save that for another time. So it was great meeting both of you, and thanks a lot for your time.